This is the last reflection on our Dante T.S. Eliot course. The focus in this reflection will be on T.S. Eliot's The Rock, which isn't often commented on, and then probably one of Eliot's finest works in poetic philosophy and theology, the Four Quartets, which in some ways sums up in a very congealed, compact, and manner his understanding of the nature of formation, the nature of wisdom, and how we can lose our way on our journey if we're not careful and end up like Dante in the Commedia itself, midway through life, in a forest and not sure where we're going in that sense because of previous decisions. In that sense, how Eliot starts Four Quartets with time past, time present, and time future, and how time future is contained in time past and present. And if that's the case, what is redeemable and what is not redeemable based on past, present, and future. But I will get to that in a few minutes. First, The Rock. I have reflected with you in a previous reflection on Murder in the Cathedral, which is probably read more and discussed more than The Rock. But The Rock was written about the same time, and it's significant, Eliot being Eliot. Any metaphor that is used is layered, and depending on how far or deep a person wants to go with a metaphor, a fuller understanding what, in this case, Eliot is up to will be revealed or unconcealed in that sense. So at a very surface level, a very literal level, a rock is a rock is a rock. Is that what Eliot's getting at? Well, of course not. But what's the truth in the literal rock? The second level would be within the Christian tradition, the notion that somehow Peter is the rock, based on a comment in reflecting that you are Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says to him upon this statement, or some would say upon the statement, I shall build my church. Now in Greek there's Petros and Petra. And so is he saying, was it upon the statement he would build the church, or upon Peter? This is another understanding of the rock. Is this what Eliot's getting at in his play, The Rock? Or is there even more to the metaphor than literal rock, or the statement of Peter to Jesus? And of course there is. So the rock is really a play that begins at a literal level of workmen, working class people, in fact. And this will be significant because whose version of working class? Within political thought, there's the right will focus on the working class people, the labor, as will the left. And so it's fascinating that what is going on to start the play, The Rock, is first of all the issue of the need to build a church, a literal church building in an area of England in which there is not a church building. And who's doing it? It's the working class people. But there's immense opposition to the building of the church for a variety of reasons, increasingly so in a secular age. Why would you be building more churches? It's not pointless. Cannot money be spent in education, healthcare systems, a whole variety of issues, better wages for working class? Why all this money spent on something which seems to be fading, which seems to be quite irrelevant? And so there's this doubting, this questioning. Why would you even do this? Because the age of Christendom is over. Christianity is finished. Is this not Don Quixote and Sancho Panza at work? And of course, Eliot is addressing these issues because the 1930s, when this particular play was run, it was part of the Canterbury Festival, was a period of time in which leftist politics was emerging. Soviet Union, Marxism was certainly taking off at this period of time, and so economics became the primary thing, and the working class people were the people that were seen as the future, and the rise of the proletariat against the bourgeois. So Eliot is dealing significantly in The Rock, and so which ideological rock are we going to turn to for hope and meaning and moving forward in history as a society, as a civilization? And one of the major threats was the left in England at the time. This was also a time of the Depression after 1929 and the stock market collapse. Many people were out of work, couldn't pay rent, cost of living was going high. So it was a dire time within English European world history, in which the call for how money is spent and where to put time was very much focused on those who were the least of these who were suffering, who did not have work, adequate employment, housing, etc. It has some overlap with what we're living with today, but certainly much more extreme at that period of history. And there were all sorts of answers being offered to that. So then, why build a church? What's the purpose of it, both at a larger ideological level, but just all the pressing needs of the time in the 1930s for working class people, the rise of alternate political ideologies, democratic socialism, communism. And so this is dealt with significantly. And Eliot does start with the working class people. And so one would think, why are they building a church? Well, they get paid to build a church, but is that the only reason to build a church? And so as the drama unfolds in the Rock, the question increasingly becomes of whose version of the Rock? Can we turn to working class people? And if so, whose version of working class people? Are they dependable, like a rock? Rock at a literal level, of course, at its best, is something that's firm, it's solid, that can be depended on. And so underneath the metaphor of the rock is what can be depended on. Where is the foundation any of us can turn to build our personal lives, communal lives, political lives, larger public lives? And Eliot is unpacking this metaphor in many meaningful ways. What then he begins to turn to is the rock of memory. So he looks at a variety of previous bishops in London, early archbishops of Canterbury, one of the third archbishops of Canterbury. So this is a rock. Here is someone who has built churches in a period of time when it looked like this is pointless, but against much odds, he was faithful and continued. This particular Bishop of London was a great bridge builder between the emerging Roman Catholic tradition in England and the Celtic heritage within England itself. So rather than the Roman Catholic tradition is the answer contra the Celtic form of Christianity, he was a bridge builder. So this is a form of a rock that Eliot is getting at. Who are those who are bridging different, in this case, ecclesial tribes, different theological tribes? And so Eliot is turning to this particular Miletus, who was the, as I said, the third Archbishop of Canterbury. And so this then is a rock which Eliot will turn to, but he's also looking at how the rock of history, when understood, interpreted, deciphered in a thoughtful way, can be a rock of insight. It can be a rock of wisdom by which people, when they're amidst of opposition and as the play unfolds, the agitators turn up again and again in the play and make the builders feel like fools who are doing something that's pointless. Christianity is at the end of history, so why continue? And so Eliot is looking at the whole notion of the positive read of history as a rock, and how the cloud of witnesses, if one turns to and listen to them, they can be sources of hope and encouragement when one is tempted towards despair, cynicism, skepticism. And so this becomes another way of unpacking the metaphor of the rock. Another story he will turn to is the situation in the Old Testament when Ezra and Nehemiah were going back to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and they had immense opposition from those in the area, all sorts of subterfuge in terms of undermining the work of those who were following Ezra and Nehemiah. But Ezra and Nehemiah were faithful in the midst of a context where they could have easily doubted, become paralyzed by their doubt, and simply quit. And so again, we get T.S. Eliot bringing in other stories from history, and there's a variety of people he will recall from history that encourages the workers in this case to say, I see this is not the first time in history we have tried to do something in the face of perpetual opposition, perpetual doubts, perpetual tendencies to be paralyzed and not to go on. And so Eliot draws forth throughout the play, The Rock, various ways of looking at what is worth being stable too. What is solid in time? And in the midst of that, the ongoing opposition in our own heads, opposition in culture, opposition education, politics. And so when one is trying to build something that's going to last, how is that to be done without slipping into the tendency towards cynicism, skepticism, and opposition can cause the flower in a person's life to wilt and just give up. And so within the rock, Eliot is working again and again on this notion of what is stable, what is a foundation, what will last, and not always, interestingly, he draws the same few lines from Christian in the four quartets, is if a people are excessively fixated on the fruit, and they're not guaranteed the fruit they're going to get from action, then often they don't act. And in the rock, as in four quartets, is our task is just to fare forward. Not always to ask, will we fare well, Voyager, but just fare forward. Do what needs to be done and not ask questions about the fruit of our action, because we can't predict the fruit of our action. If we only act when we're guaranteed fruit, then we probably won't act much of the time. And so in the rock, the chorus again and again is reflecting on the notion of choice, of action, but not being excessively preoccupied to know the fruit of one's action. So sow the seeds, sow the seeds. We cannot be guaranteed how the seeds will break through their skin and what sort of results there will be in the sowing of the seeds. Similar in ways to Thomas Merton's New Seeds of Contemplation. The seeds sown in the soil, that's all we're responsible for. We are not responsible for how those seeds are cultivated, how they grow or don't grow in that sense. And of course the opposition of the thorns, the hard ground, the stones in the soil. So the rock is it's a powerful play in essence of what is stable, what is a foundation worth building, and in the process of doing that, if it's meaningful, there will be opposition. There will be people who oppose. There will be agitators, and some of them will come forward with pretty significant arguments for why not to go on in that sense. And Eliot explores all this. He was acutely aware. He lived at the center of these big culture wars of his time, and he knew what it meant to be betrayed, opposed by those who he once seemingly was on the same page with in terms of larger philosophical, literary, religious, political ideologies and ideas. So the rock, like A Murder in the Cathedral, it addresses some of the larger religio-political issues of the time in a very explicit way, in a way that some of his poetry doesn't do in quite the same way, although it is all there implicitly in his poetry itself. Now, Four Quartets starts with Heraclitus's two aphorisms of Heraclitus, which are very important. In one of them, he contrasts the Logos with Phronesis. And Logos, in that classical sense, is about the presence of that which is, that which comes to us, that evokes, that calls forth who we're meant to be. But the second part of that couplet in Greek is Phronesis, in which each interpret it in our own undeveloped, immature way, which means inevitably we are going to distort the Logos of the presence of that which is because of our own interpretive tendencies. Because we ourselves see through a glass darkly, we often don't see or hear properly, and this then leads to problems, difficulties in each person's life of interpreting things in ways that often the tendency is to interpret the feed into an egoism and narcissism, a self-justifying way of being. And so we think we're interpreting things that are going to lead to meaning. We create our own little rocks, as it were, that we think are going to be foundations, but they're weak foundations, similar to the parable Jesus once talked about, the person who built their house upon rock and others who build their house upon sand. And when the tempests and the storms come, those who built their mansions on sand, inevitably the rock of their soul or the rock of society does not hold because it's built on sand, versus someone who slowly, quietly, wisely builds the house of their soul and society on the rock. And so in one sense, Four Quartets and the rock are companion pieces four quartets coming a little later, historically in Eliot's thinking and writing. But in the Heraclitus aphorism, he's already digging into or listening to the insights of Heraclitus, also the way up and the way down, or the odos in that way, are the same. So those who think they can ascend into meaning without also being consistent in how they live in their lives, or spirituality cut loose from life in time and history, the two have to be integrated, organically one. Some like to do the ascent, the contemplative, but they don't like to integrate how is, in terms of means that are used, how is the life in the ascent to the peaks and spirituality, and what's the relationship of that to justice, peacemaking, ecological concerns. There has to be an integration of means and ends in Heraclitus's comment, or the aphorism here. So Eliot's bringing together in a preface to the four quartets important means to organically integrate in thought, word, and deed how one understands the personal life, the friendship life, the communal life, the public life in one organic way of seeing and being. In this sense, there's a high Tory element in T.S. Eliot's poetic philosophy in four quartets, which you also see in The Rock as well as Murder in the Cathedral. But one has to stitch together all the different approaches, or as it were, almost different doors into the cathedral of Eliot's thought, which is very also grounded in thousands of years of thinking. Just as in The Rock, he's constantly drawing from women and men who are in the thick of the big issues, so in four quartets, he's drawing from an immense resource base, or library, of Western and Eastern civilization. Four quartets is divided into four sections. One is Burnt Norton. Again, a metaphor. Is he talking just about a mansion or a large house? No, he's talking about the burning down of civilization. And so he wants us to realize very clearly at the outset that the Western civilization, which once stood for a rich reservoir of wisdom and insight, and did it have its dross? Did it have its chaff? Of course it did. Eliot's no naive thinking in terms of some golden age that all things were perfect and well put together. But there was also a richness in this great tradition, and as increasingly becomes diminished, attacked, as it is today in the larger culture, where people only picking on the negative stories, the negative, and they become addicted to negativity without saying the other side of the story, which is all the richness and greatness of the West. So Burnt Norton is the burning down of something that was rich. It was a home of hospitality for many, many people, and it is no more. And so how do we navigate? How do we navigate when the great stories are gone, when the great myths have disappeared? What is perennially still existing that we can interiorly think about, live forth, engage in the larger world? So the many themes in Burnt Norton that start with time past, time present, time future, then move into a discussion of be careful of romanticizing this idyllic nature of the past, which really did not exist other than in our imagination. So be careful of being addicted to idealized notions of that the imagination as a faculty projects, which do not exist in all its idyllic way. And then he moves on to the second part of that, in which he looks at how garlic and sapphire exist together. And this is the nature of reality itself. Underneath it, though, what he's trying to get at is the contemplative way in which we live in a world which is constantly in motion, moving constantly. Our internal life, our mind, our imagination, nature itself is constantly changing. The public world is not stable. So where, in a sense, is the rock in all this? Is there any place we can turn at a personal level, a friendship level, where there is stability, where there is predictability that lasts, or is all life just flux? And that's all there is. Do we just make up our own reality? Or is the presence of the Logos that is always there? But we have to learn to be attentive and attuned and know how to listen in a contemplative way to know that still point in the moving world. And part of Burnt Norton, Eliot is contrasting the transience, the flux, the instability, the moving river of life, and asking the question: is this all there is, or is there this still point? And if there is still point, if there is this rock, in that sense, the still point and the rock are playing off one another in these two works of Eliot. How do we get to it? How do we discover it? And Heraclitus is again is the logos is always presencing itself. But if we're not present to the presencing of that which is present, we miss entirely, and then we get disoriented on our journey. And it's even harder living in a culture such as Burnt Norton, in which all the landmarks, all the markings, all the trails have become obliterated. So our challenge is even more difficult when the memory has been dismembered, that has been clear cut in that sense. And Eliot's trying to provide a trail, a path forward in a culture in which many of those myths, stories, historic landmarks, communities exist no more in the way they once did. So much of Burnt Norton is the beginning of trying to get at something that now East Coker, which is the second one, this is where Eliot's ashes are, East Coker in southwest area of England. He begins to track again and again, and as Eliot always does, is he himself is a child of generations and generations going back to East Coker. So what's the relationship? What's the relationship of who I am as a person in my very short period of time to the past, to generations of generations who have preceded me, but not just immediate family, but cultural generations which have preceded me. Just as Eliot, an earlier work called Tradition and the Individual Talent, looks at all of this history lives within, if we know but how to heed, to hear, to live from it. And so the actual turn to East Coker is also a turn to how generations and generations culturally can live within us. So part of understanding the still point in the moving world is not just a private journey, it's a cultural journey in how we find the insight and the wisdom of those who have gone before us to be attentive, attuned, and vocationally live into wisdom, justice, peacemaking, and in this case, ecological concerns. I use ecology consciously so, because many of the images that Eliot will draw from are profoundly nature images. And so Dry Salvages, which is the third of the four quartets, again we get the image of nature, the river, the dark river, the god, the movement and the change, once again, of nature itself. Dry Salvages are interesting. It's a lovely little area just off New England. And a person enjoys kayaking, you can kayak out to the Dry Salvages, the little salvages, just like Little Gidding. There's Greater Gidding, Lesser Gidding, and Little Gidding in England. The Dry Salvages are a beacon, and when the tide comes in, it is not overwhelmed. The lesser salvages, there's no sense of orientation anymore, because when the tide comes in, it covers up those rocks. What he's talking about, it's a fascinating area just off the coast in New England, in which the tide comes. It doesn't overwhelm those particular rocks, so it remains in that sense a natural lighthouse in which there's a smaller beacon on it. And so in the midst, again, in this case, of sailors, and we're right now into Homer and many other great works, when Eliot taps into water and oceans and sailing, he's very much talking about the sailing of life, people on the boat of life. We're right into Odysseus, and James Joyce will use this in his more psychological read of the Odyssey itself. Water is very important. Again and again it'll come up for Eliot, because water signifies the sub and the unconscious, the myths that often we forget, which are a part of who we are, but if we misread them or don't read them, they themselves are rocks. Great myths, they convey the great perennial truths of the human journey. This is why I think the great attraction to great epic journeys like Lord of the Rings, Chronicles of Narnia, Harry Potter, Dune, any of the great epic stories, they're myths. that also will take us to the still point. So there's the myths of people we know, or the stories we know through history, which are part of building of civilizations. There's the perennial myths that are told again and again and again, which all of us on our journey, if we are attentive, we are a part of that larger epic civilizations itself. They can take us to the still point in the moving world as well. And so, as Eliot unpacks the dry, which is water, sailing consciously across the water of time on the ship with others. So, there's the external weather systems of time. How do we navigate with people when we're on a ship, as it were, crossing water of time, where there's differences on the ship? How are we to navigate the ship? It's very interesting how Dante will go after Ulysses actually in the Inferno for not knowing how to navigate properly, or going beyond where he should go beyond. With Eliot, he's very careful in this with his, he would certainly read Ulysses quite different than with Dante in the Commedia, particularly in the Inferno. But in the Dry Salvages is, where is the lighthouse? Where is the rock of stability when you lose your way? What gets overwhelmed by the water in time so we lose our way entirely as the various tides of life come in? And where is that place that even the tides of time and its cycles that stands above the tides of time, and we can navigate our communal ship of life across it? It ends with Little Gidding, and this is Eliot's, in that sense, answer to say, if we live in community, communities are the way, and they're imperfect, often frustrating, irritating ways, but it is in communities that in fact are a rock. They're the salvages in the midst of the shifts and changes of time, that people are with us in the various phases and seasons of life itself. I lived for Little Gidding for a time. It's just outside of Cambridge. There's Greater Gidding, Lesser Gidding, and Greater Gidding. And Eliot really holds up Little Gidding as an example, metaphorically, mythically, obviously not just literal Little Gidding, but again, when one probes what he's getting at in this particular final section of the four quartets, the place of home, the place of rest, the place of the true family, which doesn't mean he idealizes that in terms of getting back to the burnt Norton. He recognizes the nature of the journey is constantly a contested one, in terms of contesting ourselves. What do we have to let go of? What do we die to? What do we leave behind? And what happens when we don't do that, or others don't do that? What happens in terms of, is there any rock anymore? Are there any more dry salvages that stay dry above the tides of time? How do we sail a ship if people are constantly mutiny, challenging, and insisting there's a multiplicity of directions the ship could go? It ends up then just going round and round and going nowhere on the journey of life. So Little Gidding, which Eliot ends with, as I mentioned earlier, it's a complementary, and I'm just hinting at some of the themes here because this is Little Gidding is a library, that there are more books written on Little Gidding than obviously the size of Little Gidding and four quartets than the size of small little four quartets itself. So the Rock and four quartets are companion works, different genres being used, but both getting at the notion of where is the rock, where is the foundation, what are we building the house of the soul, the house of community, the house of society on? Is it on a rock? And if so, what's the nature of a rock in its varied ways in terms of history and myth and community and thinking? All of these public responsibilities. Four quartets, he's doing exactly the same thing, only much more sophisticated in terms of philosophical and theological probes into the human soul and how we can lose our way if we do not know where the still point, but how do we get to the still point? And four quartets is an unpacking of the diversions, the distractions we can be on, but also the actual means by understanding that still point in the moving world.